In the deserts of Ayun, there stands a forest made from tall, proud redwoods that reach up towards the heavens. The forest itself thrums with a magic that had taken root nearly half a century ago, and was, in fact, the first instance of magic ever recorded in the histories of Erahim. The forest had bloomed seemingly overnight into a grove before slowly extending outwards with the curiosity of a newborn fawn. Once it had stopped growing outwards, it began to reach towards the sky. The trees that formed it quickly took the mantle of the tallest structures in the explorable world. The branches of these trees grew into a thick canopy, giving way to beautifully ornate leaves that bore a shade of red that had never been seen before in nature. Somewhere between a ruby and a scarlet. Some had even claimed that in the right light, with the right winds, the leaves gave off an iridescent shimmer, like ghost lights dancing in the treetops. The magic of the forest and its sudden appearance spread like wildfire throughout the continent of Erahim, attracting a number of intrigued parties to its borders. Anyone from researchers to scholars, adventurers to simple tourists, Erahimians traveled great distances to set their eyes upon the Forest of Miracles, a name that had lovingly found its way into the lexicon of anyone who knew anything about the forest. Unfortunately, many of these individuals quickly discovered that miracles were far from what awaited curious wayfarers. No, the forest was akin to something more along the lines of a venomous shamble trap. Its exterior was mesmerizing, inviting, almost hypnotic, but many who dared to set foot inside were never heard from again, and those that were able to survive only seemed to skirt around the edge of the forest, despite setting a bearing for the exact middle. Indeed, the forest had claimed many lives, irrespective of age, culture, occupation, or any other factor, and eventually entering the forest became forbidden, and decades after its springing into life, only rule breakers or adrenaline seekers took on the challenge of traversing it. Despite their courage, their fate was the same as those who had come before them, never to be seen or heard from again. It wasn't for nearly a quarter of a century that someone, or more accurately a group of someones, emerged from the forest. Their survival, however, was not the most peculiar aspect of their arrival. It was the fact that they had never entered the forest, or at least there was no record of them having done so. No, they seemed to simply materialize from inside the forest itself, creating a stir of whose magnitude had never once before been felt in the continent, even when compared to the fall of the monarchy. To make matters even more perplexing, the individuals that emerged seemed to have inherited some of the power of the forest, bringing to life rumors that survivors were actually tree people, ents that had somehow grown alongside the massive redwoods like a secret whispered in the leaves. These magically capable individuals, who later came to be known as Enchanterians, yet another loving nickname that was adopted by any and all, were strange in comparison to the natives of Erahim. They called themselves elves and were the first of their kind, with sharp, pointed features and long, lanky bodies. They brought with them the magics that must have been locked away deep within the forest. They never chose to answer or even entertain questions on the origins of their magic, or their own origins for that matter, not for want of trying from the people of Erahim. The elves also carried a strange assortment of crafts, instruments with arcane sigils carved into them that seemed to glow a deep red, which further substantiated the rumors. Books filled with symbols that no one could translate save for the elves themselves, and a myriad of strange concoctions of seemingly omnipotent liquids, some of which could bring someone back from even the brink of death. Though they wouldn't teach others to make the crafts, they were more than willing to share them with those that were interested in learning how to access the origin, the name given to the sourceless well of arcanum that the elves claimed to tap into in order to bring their magic to life. They even taught willing Erahimians how to access the origin and perform magics of their own, which was much appreciated. Unfortunately, it soon became clear that not every Erahimian would have the same capabilities in enchanting. In fact, those that were able to were in the narrow minority of the population. Nonetheless, this didn't stop communities from sending their capable citizens to learn from the elves as they traveled from one town or city to the other. Soon, every major city and most towns had some semblance of enchanturians that enabled it to prosper, be it by aiding citizens with ailments or recoveries, assisting with town defenses, helping to nurture crops for harvest, or some other application of the arcane arts. The elves also designated a number of individuals based on the size of the population to act as stand-in instructors when they were gone, as the elves would only stop for a few days in every location. This created a self-sustaining system of enchanturians and ensured that there would be some way for them to pass on the metaphorical torch. Of course, there were laws set in place as well, to ensure the proper and fair use of magic. The first law stated that enchanturians were forbidden from creating something from nothing. For example, it was forbidden to create foods or crops unless in the most dire of circumstances, something akin to famine or starvation. If one was to wield magic to create something, the materials must already exist before the magic was performed, thus making it transformation rather than creation. This was a law created by the elves themselves, and it was speculated that this was, in part, a major contributing factor to their emergence from the forest. And it was true that as the elves traversed the continent, they also exchanged goods. Some returned to the forest with these goods in tow. The second law that was put in place stated that the use of magic against other creatures, including non-humanoids, was strictly forbidden save for matters of extreme self-defense. And even those who claimed self-defense were often met with intense scrutiny to justify the use of their power, sometimes being found guilty of malpractice. This led to the creation, with the assistance of the elves, of magical dampeners that were capable of suppressing the powers of enchanturians who would misuse their abilities in order to ensure that they wouldn't cause further harm. While the dampeners didn't remove the individual's capabilities, they siphoned it off, releasing it harmlessly as strange colored wisps of light that would float up to the sky like the last puffs of smoke from the embers of a campfire. The last law stated that should a task be capable of being completed with relative ease, the parties involved should do everything in their power to complete it in a manner absent of enchanting. This was by far the most difficult law to hold individuals accountable to, and it became the first of the laws to be broken. It was little things at first, like using magic to do menial household chores when no one was looking. What difference did it make if you put your clothes on a line to dry or waved your hand and created a miniature wind tunnel the size of an adult's fist to wick the clothes of their moisture? Who would mind if instead of going over to the cabinet yourself to get your snack, you had it float its way over to you as though it was being carried by a magical butler? However, as people became more accepting of the flexibility of the third law, those charged with upholding the law included, this lapse in judgment would eventually compound, leading to the bending and breaking of the second law as well. About 10 years after the elves had emerged, contests between enchanturians became commonplace. It started out as competitions to gauge the might, speed, and overall ability of casters and assign relative scores, but escalated into gladiatorial combat in which enchanturians battled with one another. The victor would return home with spoils, often a relatively generous amount of money and a position on a high-ranking official's payroll. The loser, however, returned home with nothing but injuries they incurred during the battle. The bouts became more and more violent. They originally implemented only the use of magic that would limit the movements and magical outputs of the opponent, but eventually they escalated into deadly combats that resulted in the loser not returning home at all. After some time, competitors became hard to find, leading to a rampant surge of non-consenting combatants who would, at times, be forced to do combat against creatures beyond the scope of the average citizen's day-to-day experience, ranging from blind rabid dogs to vicious leathery winged creatures known as wyverns in some of the most prominent battles. Finally, once the boundaries had been pushed enough, many Enchanterians began to create things from nothing, whether it was the result of being backed into a corner or simply just because they could. Money, food, clothing, weapons, anything that could be conceived began to be created magically. And those cities with the greatest number of Enchanterians saw the most benefits, outcompeting other towns and cities to the nth degree with little to no effort. Smaller towns without any Enchanterians fell by the wayside, forced to abandon their homes or wither away alongside their dwindling resources. This was the last stepping stone towards the Great War. The pot had been simmering for quite some time with the surge of magic, but its subsequent corruption caused it to overflow. A militia, known as the Sentinels, emerged from the shadows, composed of concerned citizens from across all of Erahim under the direction of Atlas Oberman. Atlas had had his concerns from the moments mentions of the elves were made, but when he discovered that they had chosen a pilgrimage across the continent, and that their numbers weren't truly known to anyone outside of the forest, his concerns turned to action. As the presence of magic grew and the continent became more and more unstable, the ranks of the Sentinels increased exponentially. By the time war had arrived, nearly 50% of the population had joined or in some way supported the Sentinels. While the Enchanterians had been twisting and bending the laws of nature to their will, under Atlas's watchful eye, the Sentinels had been training and preparing to bring them to heel. However, when war finally came, it was far worse than anyone, Atlas included, could have foreseen.